Pressing record. And my name is Liza Schade, and today's date is May 22nd, 2020. And this is an oral history recording for Portland State University Public History Lab with Patricia Schechter. And we are here with former president of Portland State University, Dr. Is it Ramaley?
Correct.
Correct. And so I'm just gonna start in with the first question, just super general, just to get us started. And for the recording, can you just kind of state your credentials for the recording?
My credentials. My name is Judith Ramaley. I was president at Portland State from 1990 to 97. I then became president at the University of Vermont, then led the Education and Human Directorate at the National Science Foundation, then went to Minnesota and led a place called Winona State University, which is a regional comprehensive. I returned to Portland in 2012, in theory, retired, but in practice, I'm not sure what that word means. So I am a distinguished professor of public service in the Hatfield School of Government, president Emerita, and I'm now also a member of the PSU Board of Trustees. My background is in the sciences. My doctorate is in anatomy, and I taught in medical schools until I moved into administration.
All right, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, thorough explanation. So during your time as president of PSU from 90 to 97, what was your sense of student needs on the campus? So in other words, what kind of challenges were on the forefront during that time?
There were several. The first one was because after I'd been here about 2 months, the voters of Oregon passed something they called Measure 5, which was a property tax measure. But the result was that it began to move dollars out of higher education and into K-12. So the first problem was we were losing support for our entire mission. But that also meant that there were reductions in state support for students who were attending college. And the particular array of federal programs did not support part-time students at all, for example. So we were already a complex institution with students who were trying to balance their educational agenda and pathway with a lot of other life issues, and it became very difficult to figure out. And we're going through that again now for a different reason, but there's some interesting similarities that occasionally haunt me. The second issue was we were not as diverse ethnically or racially then as we are becoming now. We were less than 10% anything other than Caucasian. And so one of the large issues that I and my colleagues dealt with was how do we begin to create ways for a more diverse campus community to develop. And so the first minority multicultural center was started, not in a very good place. Patricia will be amused. We had to take the old faculty lounge, which nobody lounged in, but it was in the basement. So it was not exactly, if you looked at all the unintended consequences, it sounded as though we did not care. And in fact, we did care enormously, but that's the only space we had that wasn't already fully being used. The third issue was student representation in helping to build the institutions. So we set up a student ambassador program, which continues on to now. And sort of the final issue was that I would list is Portland State was still seen as Portland State University. In other words, spoken very softly, and the Oregonian called us pretty sorry university, PSU. So we weren't pretty sorry. We, in fact, were already distinguishing ourselves as one of the first fully urban serving institutions. But we didn't have that identity as such. We developed that in that year. So if you think about the list I just reeled out at you, we have characteristics of all of those today.
Absolutely.
We are much more diverse, but we are not yet taking advantage of the incredible resource that is created. We are deeply woven into the community, but people tend to take us for granted or not notice us. I can see Patricia going, and I can go through all of them. And money flows not to us, but to prisons and to other things. I still remember the numbers I was able to gather. How much does it cost the state in 1992, I think was, to educate a student compared to what it would cost to incarcerate someone in a medium security prison? In those days, you could educate 6 Portland State students for each person that was incarcerated. I don't know what the numbers would be now. But it was a pretty powerful argument to make with the legislature at the time. It didn't help. We still got cut, but I wanted them to feel bad about it.
So in terms of that, sorry, I wanted to go back to this one question I had. Yeah, you had talked about the Oregonian calling PSU pretty sorry, right? So in terms of that compared to, for example, U of O, is that what you're talking about, in that U of O, OSU was getting all of the funding and attention?
Well, that's a complicated story, but basically, at that time, then 7 public institutions that were 4-year or undergraduate and or graduate degree conferring were held together in one thing called the OSHE, Oregon State System of Higher Ed. It later decided that was not a good term, and they called themselves OUS, Oregon University System. It was the same logic. And the majority of the members of the board were from U of O or OSU.
Okay.
I think I remember one person might have been from PSU. I don't recall that. I'm the kind of person that doesn't remember detail. I just remember broad strokes because I have to fill my head with an X set of details and hold on to it long enough to use it and then move on. So I don't remember specifically. The challenge was that we were sitting, Portland State was sitting in the heart of Oregon's population, its economic capacity, because the extraction industries were already starting to fail. And we shipped all of our timber abroad instead of having value-added agriculture, for example. So we were already doing things that at a public scale were, may I say, stupid. But anyhow, Portland State was critically important, but it was sitting near the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And so U of O and OSU were rapidly and effectively invading with the same programs to try to capture, sort of like that old phrase, why did Al Capone rob banks? Because, well, that's where the money was. Well, this is where the resources and the people were. That's, of course, much worse today than it was then. And still an issue, and no longer any particular means to figure out what's in the best interest of the institutions, each of them, and the state. And the pandemic is clearly stripping away, at one level, any attempt to be civil, and at another level has made us so interdependent that we need each other and are sharing ideas all the time. And I don't know which of those two will prevail when the pressure begins to drop. It'll be very interesting.
Definitely. This is such a crazy situation.
Well, it is, because it's the classic tale of two cities. Best of times, worst of times.
Right.
We're behaving in ways that capture the richest part of our humanity, and at the same time are getting nastier and more self-absorbed than ever at the same time. I find this confusing.
One of those paradoxes of life, you know?
Yeah.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about, can you talk about your activism in higher education and work reform and your goals with organizations like Second Nature and the Talleries Network?
From very early in my career, not so much when I was a member of the faculty full-time, but as I started moving into administration, I began to think about what does it mean to be educated. And at the time I was starting to think about this in a kind of way. The curriculum was still pretty much based on what people wanted you to know about their field, without, not that that's bad, but it missed a connection to the individual student's interests and life experiences, and also did not frequently connect well to the problems that society was facing that a particular field could shed light on or help people explore. So that was problem number one. The other problem was most of the problems that were already pretty clear back in those days, which was the middle 1970s through the 1980s, were complex enough that no single discipline could possibly offer enough insight for anyone to figure out what to do, because they would involve social, cultural, economic, environmental, political. And so I, from that early point on, did my best to start talking about what does it mean to be educated? How do we create at the undergraduate level a different kind of experience? And at the graduate level, how do we create what you might call a T-shape, in which there is a deep set of roots, hence the tree behind me, which is a painting, by the way, if you wondered. And I happen to like it. Roots in a particular conceptual approach, whether it's a form of history or anthropology or engineering, it didn't matter. But across it, the capacity at the graduate level to connect, particularly for the kinds of questions that most people are likely to ask, connect insights from other fields. And so one of the efforts I made, and I ended up having a lot of opportunities to do this, is we totally reinvented our general education curriculum at Portland State, turned it into university studies.
Okay.
That was my first chance, finally, to work with a group of people who were trying to think through a deeper educational philosophy. What are we trying to achieve? What kind of person would we like to represent us in the future? How would you know a PSU grad from any other institution unless they wore their, sweatshirt with their go bees, go bikes, go ducks on it? Never have like go ducks, even though I'm a bird watcher. But anyway, so that's one form of reform. And I ended up, we got a lot of recognition for our efforts, and it became the base for what became liberal education in America's promise at AAC, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and is now part of the sort of next generation. We're now 2 generations in. I'm still part of that because I'm a faculty member there, High Impact Practices Institute and so on. So that's one. The other, there were 2 others. One was universities cannot prepare their graduates in the ways that we were figuring out through that first deep exploration of what it means to be educated, without connecting deeply into the community and learning with the community, not serving it. So service learning was a term I would not let cross my lips, either hyphenated or not, because there was a great argument in the academy about whether you hyphenate service learning or not. But anyhow, that what we needed was some form of truly community-based learning, but also community-based discovery. And we're still in higher education realizing we can learn together rather than learning and sharing what we figured out. So that's another one that's still on my agenda, I still care about very much, is the connection to community. The third one we've already touched on, which is the fact that our own country is becoming much more complex in its demography. The world is now opening up into a different world order. And of course, the pandemic shows that in ways that are indisputable. And so how do we move from language like diversity, equity, inclusion to actually having a community that has those qualities? So I've been trying to sort all that out since probably since I became a provost back in 1982 at SUNY Albany. I didn't give you all that background. And I gradually have tried over time to find kindred souls and ways to learn together. What does it mean to be educated? What does it mean to find out what your own strengths and gifts and interests are? How do you then decide the best way to share those with others and receive theirs in return?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't exactly have good answers to that one, but it's a worthy goal.
Yeah. Well, it's an ongoing process too,
Yep.
I really like what you say about you know, not only changing the language, but actually applying it and enacting that social change and making it happen, not just standing back and saying, well, we need to do this and that and that. So I think that was a really great point that you just made.
Well, that's been a pet peeve of mine for many years. When I was just getting started as an American Council on Education fellow in academic administration, my first mentor said to me one day in exasperation, he was a vice president at the time, but the guy was giving me most help. He said, you know, faculty love to admire a problem and then they think they're done. Now, that's an unfair, nasty statement, but collectively, we feel once we've named it, we're not sure how to turn it into how we behave, what we pay attention to. And so what I'm enjoying actually about our current situation with all the tensions that go with being thrown into remote mode so quickly is it's speeding up our ability to do this. And unlike most other institutions that I have connections with, what we are doing is trying to learn as we go, which is the essential piece that revs up the engine that hardly anybody does. They tend to wait till the end and they look at what they've got and go, oh, I think this means. And so instead, learn as you go, try it, tweak it, let it go and try something else. We didn't have any choice.
That kind of makes me connect. What you just said really makes me see your scientist mind, learning as you go, testing, applying, changing, you know, always trying to tweak it, like you said. So I think that's cool how you connected that.
I have exposed how my mind works.
Yeah. Hey, it works. So that's what matters, right? So was there anything else about second nature or Talleries in specific maybe that you wanted to say?
Until bar, no, because I really haven't been involved in that for 25 years. I don't even know if it still exists.
Okay.
With respect to other things like second nature, or Portland Audubon, or all the other things I have led, what I can say is that where you pay attention to a problem somewhat depends on how your mind works. And I used to try to explain to people that I'm the sort that outgrows my pot quickly. If you ever tried to grow a plant that just made you have to replant the darn thing? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, if you were to follow my entire career, I kept outgrowing my pot. When I was a faculty member, I could sort of see what the board department chair was having to deal with. When I got to be a temporary department chair, I began to understand how the other chairs working with the college saw things. When I finally got to be an associate dean, I realized, oh darn, I need to work with all the others. And so I just kept losing my own perspective for the level I was at, because the usual model is at that level, you support the people you represent.
Right.
And the problem I had was I was thinking about everybody.
Right. Well, your perspective was evolving past, it seems like, all of what you were doing. Well,
it turns out I was always that way. It just, what life experience does, it helps you figure out who you are.
Right.
And so I remember sitting with my parents one time when I was a provost, actually. And they laughed and said, you were that way as a child. It took a long time to figure this out, my dear. You know, oh, why didn't you tell me? Well, because you can't tell a kid these kinds of things, right?
Right. They might
So
not understand.
I forgave them on the spot because by that time I had 2 sons. I totally got it. But anyway, it's interesting that I have chosen to give my volunteer time to organizations that connect as broadly as possible. So Second Nature has a network of over 450 colleges and universities around the country, all trying to create the capacity for climate action to respond to climate change. And doing it through their own example and their own carbon footprints and so on, but also through collaboration with communities where they have their primary operations, usually physically where they have a campus, but in some cases, simply where they have clusters of people in some kind of virtual network. And Portland Audubon is smaller. It's only basically Oregon and Southern Washington, but it's the same idea on a different scale. And it's not just about climate action, it's about the environment and restoration of that environment to support all growing and living things. So it makes me happy.
It's all about clean living and yeah.
Well, not necessarily, but certainly not dirty living. As far as workforce, that really had to do with a couple of things that are coming to the fore now. All the people who are necessary, first responders and necessary, all tend to be people who are poorly paid, are living in difficult conditions. We don't need to go through the whole list of things because you're probably all very familiar with them. Yeah. But it illustrates the fact of how do we define the worth of work? And how do we define what it takes to be good at whatever you do? When I was a senior scholar at the National Science Foundation back almost 20 years ago now, I was very much looking at the research that was being done on just how complex it is to be an auto mechanic, to be a waitress, to be a checkout clerk at a grocery store. We were looking at the realities of the capacities that a person would have to read people, to interact with people, to remember 8 different orders and who asked for what. I mean, and this was all part of an effort to understand the deep structure of the community and what holds it together. And during the pandemic, that's another thing that's being shown so starkly, and something I don't know because I'm not directly involved with it, I'm mostly an observer, is will we learn from this? And I don't know.
That's the $64,000 question.
Well, right now it's several trillion, but I get your point.
And thinking about the worth, I love that statement. How do we find, that question I should say, how do we find the worth of work? And it's so important, especially in this time frame, like you said, because you have all of the, you know, my husband works in a restaurant. I have 15 years, same thing, right?
Well, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So let's go back to measure 5. So when you left in 97, you
Yeah.
had guided Portland State through these difficult budget cuts. Can you talk about that Measure 5 and just how you negotiated those budget cuts?
Yes. I'm actually trying to persuade our current administration to apply some lessons from then. We got through it with most of our skin intact. Basically, the first question is, how do you frame the problem? Almost always, when there's a severe downturn in resources, it's framed as, what do we cut?
Mm-hmm.
That is accompanied by everybody shrinking and trying to protect their part of it.
Right.
And that's generally associated with an unwillingness to try anything different or take any risks. So there's a pattern that follows logically from what will we cut. I chose instead to say, what are we going to do with what we're likely to have? Now that sounds awfully simple. That's like half empty, half full, but it leads to other points quickly. If we're going to talk about what we're going to do with what we have, then we need to understand what we actually have and its value. And we need to figure out, how can we do better with less, not more with less or give up stuff.
Right.
Okay, which then leads to the model we use. So the principles are, what are we going to do with what we have? And how can we get more from what we have? How can we do better with less? And how can we allow for a reasonable amount of risk? So those are kind of the three. Now, risk itself means 4 different things. There's economic, think of it as a rectangle or maybe even a square if you want each to be roughly comparable.
Mm-hmm.
One is your economic exposure. One is legal issues.
Right.
So for instance, if you have several represented groups, you have unions, you have a number of elements to consider there, but there are also other kinds of legal issues. The third one is really public opinion. How are people going to react to what you say and do?
Right.
And the fourth one is the hardest, but it's, in my mind, central. The integrity of the institution itself.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you want to be able to take risks that are acceptable. And so what we did was, I don't remember, I think it was still called OIRP, the Office of Institutional Research and Planning. I don't remember what the title was. And we had them create a portrait of each unit.
Okay.
And that could be a department. It could be a support unit. And we ask, how many people does it have? If it's revenue generating, how does it do so? If it's an active unit, it could be through credit hour production, it could be through external contracts and grants, it could be through fees for services. Similarly, with the other kinds of units, you work it out. So you figure out what's in each package. One of the things you look at with respect to the academic units was, how many students does that unit serve as graduate students, undergraduate students within undergraduate majors versus service courses of one kind or another. And with respect to other units, there are different questions, but there are a set of 4 or 5 questions. So you've got a portrait. You then give each unit their portrait so they can dispute it if you got it wrong. And some did. And then you say, we noticed you haven't had a graduate in 8 years. Or, you know.
Right.
And we say, basically, show cause. Talk to us about what could you do differently to become more attractive or to become more engaged or to generate a way to offset costs and so on. And we didn't have a long time to do it, but we then had a group of people, and I don't remember now how they were constructed, but they were done we did that in cooperation with different representative groups like the faculty senate and whatnot. Listen to each unit present its case. There were still things we had to get rid of, but even where we did, we kept the parts that could develop. So, for example, we had a college of exercise and something or other. We got rid of that college, but we kept the part that eventually became part of the College of Urban and Public Affairs. At the end of it, we had to declare exigency, which is a term of art, but we only had to lay off 11 people. And we set up a way for each of them to get help. Everyone got at least as good a job somewhere else. A few did better, unfortunately. I was embarrassed by that. Now, the times are different. The depth of the impact is even worse. We were looking at 20% reduction in the state general fund support potentially at that time. We're looking at something more complex than that now. But the idea that you try to work on the classic language of the better angels of your nature. You try to figure out how could we use the remarkable assets we have that we have not paid enough attention to, that we have not connected up in ways that are attractive and needful.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've already got early signs of ways to do that. The Board of Trustees heard about 4 new programs that the committee I'm on, Academic Student Affairs, approved back in whenever it was. It feels like the last century, but I think it was only a couple months ago. That I love it.
I know.
that carry the elements of the future we're going toward. And I won't go into the details of what those are. It's not appropriate for this conversation. Probably, in fact, very little of what I'm talking about is probably what you wanted.
It is.
But anyway, so there are ways to do this. It's not easy. It requires people to be more receptive to each other, to recognize the richness of possibility, to discover, back to the same issue as workforce, to discover the real worth of each other. And who knows where the idea is going to come from that opens the door to something better.
Right.
We're trying to involve some of our students in this, connect that to what our faculty know about learning, connect that to what all of the people who support the institution and help it function know and can do. There are an awful lot of us, and we're probably missing some beautiful ideas that we don't know how to reach.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a real effort. I'm part of two of those, President Percy's PSU Next PSU Better effort and his remote learning project. But I'm also aware of what's going on in Students First and a couple of other places, or Office of Academic Innovation. There's now an effort to figure out how do we put this all together to create a rich portrait of who we are.
Right.
It's amazing. If we can, we need a couple of historians in this, because there are lessons, looking right at you, Patricia. There are lessons that you would not apply directly, but that offer insights in other times, other places. But the lesson from our own origin story and our own history is pretty powerful.
Well, I think there is a lot of similarities with public history to what you're saying. People need to be receptive. Yep. We need to change narratives. We need to open new doors. You know, all these things that you're saying really does apply to our field as well. So, so it makes sense that they can go together. So I think we have one more question, or two possibly. In what ways have you seen Portland State University change from its early 1990s when you were there to coming back and being President Emerita today?
Well, it's interesting because when I got here, we were often thought of, as I told you, as pretty sorry university, which still makes me growl when I think about it. And we emerged as this path-breaking urban research university that had completely rethought the core of undergraduate education in the form of university studies. And so we've carried that reputation ever since. And so we're certified innovative, when in fact we're not. We're only kind of sort of innovative. But where we are is so promising that if we can learn from it and figure out how each of us with different mindsets, different ways of looking at things, different experience and expertise, if we can all begin to figure out what a truly engaged university that connects scholarship with learning with application, where all three take place collaboratively across fields as well as within them and across the university and the community. If we can pull that off, we will become a very sort of grand reflection or interpretation of what we sort of already are, but only sort of, we flicker. Oh, you think so too? Okay.
Patricia's nodding, yep, yeah.
But that flickering is so hopeful.
Yeah. It really is. I mean, that's why I love PSU, because of the multiculturalness about it, because of the so many different kinds of people coming together, the idea that we can learn to think for ourselves and analyze for ourselves and not just have information shoved into our head is a big thing for me too. So yeah, so I'm glad that was, you know, your influence on that. Did you have anything, other changes that you might notice? I don't want to push you on that question, but.
Well, I notice small things, but I don't think they're earth-shaking. I just wonder whether your format allows your colleagues to ask me questions.
Yeah, yeah, we're gonna, for sure. I think we can probably get to that point now. We're at a good stage. It's one.
Yeah, because I had to put my trustee hat back on shortly before 2. So
okay.
you were going to go to, I think, 1:45. So
Yeah. So does anybody else have any questions?
Comments, reactions, whatever.
I do. I know that there are some issues about equality and equity for students of color at PSU.
Yes.
I know that quite a few feel like they're not being seen or having challenges with their professors. My daughter, she was a student at PSU for a number of years, and she ended up dropping out because she didn't feel like she belonged. And I can feel that. I feel that when I'm on campus as well, that there's this air of, and I know that last term we were there, I think it was last term I was there was fall term, and there was a lot of racist stuff going on campus that was affecting people differently. And I wonder what we can do to make PSU more inclusive and empowering people to have a voice about their concerns and the issues that they're facing in the classroom, but also just being on campus and living on campus. Living on campus for a person of color is very difficult. A number of people came to me and we talked about it, but it seems to be a challenge. Just because you have all these different people from all these different places and they bring all of their preconceptions and their prejudices and all of that, and like in your face. So what can we do to make the campus more inclusive?
That's actually one of the reasons I'm looking forward to connecting you up to the people at AACNU, because they're trying to explore answers to that question with several institutions that are part of that effort. We're not part of it, but there are several are. My own response to your question is probably 2 pieces at the moment. One is that we are asking more people to participate in thinking through where we're headed and what that might entail. And I think, I know, for instance, that C. Percy is deliberately asking people to include a range of different backgrounds and people in those conversations. It's small, it's a tiny drop in a large group of people, but he has several students and several faculty who have formed cohorts of people they know to talk regularly through the spring term and as it remains, and then put their collective thoughts together to send to him as a record of experiences, but also what people are learning. So that's the beginning of an answer. Because many of the people I know that I've managed to talk to who have had difficult experiences on campus are never asked about that.
No, they're not. Especially we have quite a large population of Muslim Americans that attend PSU, and those women, they're awesome. And nobody really asks them how they're doing. I think that's something that needs to change. That we need to all feel like we belong to PSU, because the more diverse anything is, the better, the more it represents the population of the United States, the better it is. And when you have like all these microaggressions coming at you from, a systemic racism institute, because there are systems in place still at PSU that need to be changed.
I agree.
For education, and you start not to trust the institution.
I understand and agree the efforts we've been making, for example, with our multicultural centers that have gradually added components to capture different life experiences is a start, but I don't think much of what that conversation is about gets to, say, the provost or to the students' first people, but I think we have a chance now to open some of these pathways and I realize we're barely touching the surface of what you're talking about, but we've got to figure it out now. And I'm not sure what all to do. If I had direct experience with this, I would happily try to compare notes. All I know is being open, listening, and trying to understand is the first step. But the second step is involving those people in finding a response.
Exactly, because we all have our different groups. You have your multicultural, department, then you have your different cliques. Personally, I think for some people it works, but for me, I feel that we are being separated, not inclusive. And I would like the other students, the European students, to come in and visit those centers and not feel like they don't belong. Because if we don't come together and have discussions together as a group, it's crazy. Because I really feel like everything's separate. We're separate, and we don't come together. And we need to have, I like to have a discussion with Jay, so he can come over to the, some center and we sit down and talk. There needs to be like an inclusive that everybody can come in and we can talk about issues like race or racism or what the school really needs and what people are challenged with and how they're doing. And that's something that I saw, and I experienced, that I feel like everybody's like separated. Even like the queer center, everybody, the women, the queer center, everybody coming together and having a discussion or just hanging out together. That's how we create community. And that's the thing that is missing, is that community, that we feel like we're all connected.
Well, it's starting. There's been a group for 3 or 4 years now called the Cousins, that's made up of people representing different parts of student experience. They swelled up to something like 60 people who join their calls each week. Mm-hmm. And I, as part of my role in all this, have been interviewing some of those people. And I think where we are at this point is the first step toward what you're talking about. The multicultural centers, for instance, have one space that's a mutual space. Let's think differently about how to use it. Secondly, a lot of the people that we would like to have in the conversation can't come to campus for events and things. What they've done while being remote is they've created lounge spaces, or they use various language, different ones. For instance, the Queer Center now has a virtual lounge, and they've got something like 3 times as many people coming to interact with each other in that lounge as they've ever had in the space they occupy in Smith. There's potentially a lesson there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that would be nice if we all could have like a lounge,
All right.
It's so interesting. If I could just jump in, it's so interesting because students experience, and it's, I'd say, significantly driven by racism in our society, that students experience different levels of physical safety on campus and in public transportation. It's hugely significant. I just want to I think it'd be a fun fact for Cece and everyone here that It's one of our conflict resolution recent graduates in the master's program, a guy named Ahmed Al-Mansouri, who's Egyptian background, who's a new, Muslim student person within the Multicultural Center firmament. So go conflict resolution. So that's great. And I'll also say that this notion of inclusion through segmentation, which is, I think, what Cleophas is talking. The university's really good at that. So when there's an upset group of people, we just make a tent over here. And, it's often, it's not, it just, it's bigger than all of us, but just to notice that it, in general, the university includes through segmentation.
That is true.
And it's hardly alone. It's hardly alone in terms of how the structures of the United States have attempted to be pluralist. Okay, but that's not enough. It's just not enough. But anyway, but there's a little happy story about CR and Cleophas wants to go on for a master's. This is all an advertisement for graduate school, that we place our students precisely in these roles. CR graduates run the women's resource center. They're in the multicultural center. It's fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. So anyway, just so you know where all your work went, Judith, in the 90s, CR's running the university right now. Sorry, just
I wish you really were. We're just at the point of getting interesting. This is the kind of conversation I wish we could have be totally taken over your script, and we're out of time. But maybe there would be another opportunity, Patricia, to have a conversation with some of your students. I hope you could be part of it. You're now exposed as the kind of person that needs to be at the table. So I need to get more information. You'll send me the contact, right? So thank you, everybody. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Much appreciation. Really, big thanks for being here. And we learned so much. You were so helpful, really.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we didn't have time for other questions, but thank you all.
It was
Have
amazing.
a great day.
Thank you. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. Guard your health, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Patricia.
Bye-bye.